It's late at night and it's storming outside, so what better to talk about than the amazing world of parasites. I love parasites, and by the end of this video, I think you will too. Pretty much every species on Earth has one or two unique parasites, which means that the number of parasites probably outweighs the number of free-living animals, which makes parasitism the most common lifestyle on Earth. It's pretty likely that soon after the development of multicellular life, parasitism evolved. I mean, it just makes sense. Why work hard when you can just leech off somebody else? Now, to be fair, that's not quite true, because as you're about to find out, some parasites work very, very hard indeed. So without further ado, these are the stories of 10 of my favourite parasites in the oceans.
One of the scariest habitats to live in has to be the pelagic zone or open ocean, which has many predators but few places to hide. So, where better to hide than in someone else? That's the strategy of the barrel amphipod. These crustaceans have a very unique look, which allegedly inspired the aliens from Alien. They have two pairs of strange eyes. The small pair is for peripheral vision and gives the amphipod a field of view of almost 360 degrees of vision, whilst the large pair are adapted for seeing in the dark. So why does the amphipod need such good vision? Well, it needs to be on the lookout for its ideal host, a gelatinous salp or pyrosome.
Despite looking like plastic bags, these guys are actually our closest living invertebrate cousins, because as larvae, they have a primitive backbone known as a notochord. You'd better feel extra bad for them now, because when the barrel amphipod comes along, it's game over. Firstly, the amphipod eats the salp from the inside out while it's still alive. This feast feeds the amphipod, but it also has another purpose. The barrel amphipod is interested in property renovation. The amphipod carefully excavates all of the salp's internal anatomy, basically leaving behind just a sac. This hollow shell will then become the amphipod's new home, and the amphipod will pilot this disemboweled host across the ocean, searching for new planktonic prey. Female amphipods will also use the hollowed out salp as the perfect nursery for their young, which are initially held in a special pouch called the marsupium. Yes, just like kangaroos. Now, if you're feeling scared by these ferocious crustaceans, don't worry, because they're only ever a couple of centimetres long. However, there are definitely much longer parasites in the oceans, and the longest is probably Tetragonoporus, or the whale tapeworm.
Tetragonoporus is a type of tapeworm found inside the intestines of whales. It's been known to reach lengths of over 30 metres long and live for over 20 years. Tapeworms work a little bit like a game of snake. You start with a hooked head called a scolex, which attaches to the intestinal wall, and as the worm grows, it keeps adding on segments, or proglottids. The bigger the host's intestines, the more space there is for the worm to grow, which is why Tetragonoporus can get so big.
Now, each of these segments, once mature, has male and female gonads, so each segment can fertilise itself, each segment can also fertilise other segments, and they can fertilise other worms. But they're hermaphrodites, and it's thought that every single day, a single Tetragonoporus worm can probably produce over 500,000 eggs. Now, you might assume that tapeworms eat the flesh of their host, but they actually don't. They survive on bits of nutrients that pass through the host's intestines, which the tapeworm absorbs through their skin. Now this is why one of the symptoms of having a tapeworm can be things like a vitamin B12 deficiency.
Most of the time, tapeworms aren't a cause for concern in whales. In fact, when I used to do cetacean necropsies, it was much stranger to find a whale or dolphin without any worms at all. However, it's thought that chemical pollution from anthropogenic activity can weaken the immune system of cetaceans and make them much more susceptible to parasites. In extreme cases, a whale can have so many tapeworms that the worms actually block the whale's intestines, leaving the whale unable to eat or poo, and sometimes even leading to death.
So tapeworms might not feed on their host's tissues, but there are definitely parasites on this list which do. Introducing our trifecta of bloodsuckers, lampreys, snub-nosed eels and cookie-cutter sharks. I'm sticking these guys together because they're the only vertebrates on the list, and vertebrates are pretty boring as far as parasites go, so sorry guys. Lampreys are a very ancient, primitive type of fish that doesn't have a jaw. There's actually over 30 species. Not all of them are parasitic, and even the ones that are, they only tend to be parasites as adults. As babies, they like to live in freshwater, and they will filter feed on detritus and other bits of food in the water. And then as adults, they undergo a very scary transformation. They develop keratinized teeth to stick into their victims, and then they have this rasping tongue, like a chainsaw, which they kind of use to drill into their victims and then suck out their blood and juices. Now, in order to stop the victim's blood from clotting, lampreys produce a special anticoagulant called lamfredin. Lamfredin. For a lot of fish in the ocean, lampreys are quite annoying, but they don't do too much damage, whereas in freshwater areas, especially places like the Great Lakes, where sea lampreys aren't native, they are causing a hell of a lot of damage. In the 18 months or so that the lampreys are parasites, it's thought that they can probably kill about 40 pounds of fish, either by draining them of their blood or creating open wounds, which then cause secondary infections. A lesser known bloodsucker is the snub-nosed eel, also known as the pug-nosed eel. If you ask me, that's a good name because just like pugs are somewhat of an abomination, these guys are too. Most of the time, they like to scavenge on bits of meat on the seafloor, but they have a real penchant for burrowing inside fish whilst they are still alive and taking up residence. In 1992, 2 eels were found inside the heart of a mako shark which was caught in New York in a fishing tournament, and we think that when the shark was caught on the line and weakened, the eels seized the opportunity to burrow in. There have also been lots of anecdotal reports of them crawling in and nestling up against the backbone of other fish. The last offender in this section is the cookie cutter shark, which are very, very adorable. Now, don't be fooled by their appearance because they are one of the only parasites on this list which have attacked humans. They're also arseholes because they can survive by eating squid and small fish as well, so they consciously make the decision to prey on other animals that are bigger than them. They'll go after sharks, seals, fish, even underwater cables and submarines and swimmers. Their whole body is bioluminescent except for a small dark band around their gills. And we think that this little black patch kind of looks like the shadow of a small fish, so it tricks prey into coming close to the cookie cutter to take a bite, and that's when the cookie cutter takes advantage of them. Unlike other sharks, which tend to leave quite evenly spaced tooth marks, cookie cutters carve very distinctive round wounds in their victims. Now, when cookie cutters bite, their kissy lips create a very tight seal around the prey's flesh, and they flatten their tongues to create negative pressure or a vacuum, which helps them to stick on. The shark twists and writhes like a crocodile performing a death roll, and off pops a perfect portion of flesh. Getting a chunk bitten out of you probably hurts quite a lot, but there are definitely far, far worse fates that parasites can inflict on their hosts. Normally, if I mention barnacles, people tend to assume that I'm talking about the ones on whales, but as far as barnacles go, they're quite harmless. Barnacles don't do much to whales other than using them as a place to live whilst they filter feed from the water. At the other end of the scale, we have the genus Sacculina. These barnacles don't resemble the ones that you'll see on ships and rocks. Think of them more like the sneaking roots of a tree. As larvae, they land on crabs and they crawl around until they find a nice gap in the crab's exoskeleton. The barnacle then loses its shell and seeps into the crab's body, wrapping itself around the crab's organs and nervous system. The barnacle then forms a sac on the crab's abdomen, which is where the crab's eggs would be held. The crab's genitalia are destroyed and the crab is no longer able to molt. Now, if the barnacle lands on a male crab, it gets even worse because the barnacle will actually castrate the crab and feminize him, changing his appearance and even changing his behaviour to make him act more like a female crab. However, barnacles don't just castrate crabs. Meet Anelasma squalicola, the shark castrating barnacle. Discovered by Charles Darwin, Anelasma squalicola infects deep sea sharks like lantern sharks. Anelasma stabs sharks with a special organ called a peduncle, which is a bit like an anchor, hooking itself into the shark's skin. The barnacle then absorbs nutrients from the shark's body using special root-like structures. Now, the interesting part for me is you might think that the Sacculina barnacles and the Anelasma barnacles are very closely related, but they're not. Sacculina belongs to a big group of parasitic barnacles, but Anelasma is essentially just a normal barnacle that's gone rogue. Their closest relatives are the ones that you see on rocks and ships.
Hello, Editing Lucy here. I forgot to say whilst doing this segment that it is absolutely not true that barnacles can infect humans. I don't care what the guy on Animal Planet, Monsters Inside Me said, okay? There have been no documented medical case reports. What sometimes happens is if people get scraped by a barnacle, they'll get infected with bacteria such as Mycobacterium, and that creates a chronic infection and creates kind of a growth, what looks like a growth. We call that fish tank granuloma, but that is not the same as getting infected with a barnacle. Okay, thank you.
Now, this phenomenon of non-parasites turning into parasites actually happens quite a lot in nature. And my favourite example of this is probably the myxozoans, which are tiny, tiny parasitic jellyfish. Well, okay, they're not actually jellyfish, but they are in the phylum Cnidaria, which includes jellyfish, corals, and anemones. All cnidarians are radially symmetrical, and they have specialised stinging cells called nematocysts. Now, unlike jellyfish, myxozoans are absolutely tiny, and in fact, they are the smallest known animals on Earth. They're actually so small that they've lost a lot of the basic functions that we think of when we think of animals, and some of them have even lost the ability to respire aerobically, so about half of their genome is gone. Sometimes myxozoans will infect a fish and not really cause them any problems, but other myxozoans are behind really serious fish diseases such as whirling disease and hamburger disease. Another myxozoan species causes a condition known as soft flesh syndrome, where dead fish essentially liquefy. It's pretty gross. And that's about it, because myxozoans are so mysterious and small that we really don't know much about them. On the other hand, there are some parasites that we've known about for thousands of years, including the pea crab. This tiny little crab lives inside bivalves like mussels and oysters and picks off bits of food that the host brings in through their gills. These crabs might be tiny, but the story of their romance is not, because they have a story more dramatic than Romeo and Juliet. Female pea crabs almost never leave their homes. They're really fat to make lots of eggs, and they actually don't have a hard exoskeleton because they're pretty safe all tucked up in their host. The male pea crab, on the other hand, risks life and limb for her. Such a simp. He has special hairy legs to help him swim to her home, and he's also a lot smaller and flatter to help him leave his mussel and enter hers. Female pea crabs emit lots of pheromones which then drift out into the water, and that's what the males will follow. Now, trying to get into a bivalve can be pretty risky because the males risk getting limbs amputated or even getting crushed.
Money! Money! Money!
So some of them will spend hours upon end gently stroking the lips of the mussels to get them to open so that they can slip inside and seduce their friends. Since they're found in mussels and clams, some people worry that if they swallow a pea crab they'll be infected, but they can't survive in our stomachs, and apparently they taste quite good. George Washington was even a fan, apparently. There are actually lots of different species of pea crabs. Some of them infect mussels, some infect gastropods, and some even live up the bottoms of sea cucumbers. Pea crabs are crustaceans, and another pesky crustacean parasite is the sea louse, often found on salmon. They're a type of crustacean called a copepod, which mostly drift through the ocean as plankton, except for the parasitic ones. You know that guy that lives on the eyes of Greenland sharks? That's a copepod. Farmed salmon are particularly vulnerable to sea lice. The sea lice can affect their growth rates, they can cause problems with the heart and the liver, and severe infections can even result in death. Fish farms keep salmon in much higher densities than the wild, and this basically creates a free-for-all for the lice. Obviously, salmon is big business, so fish farms have tried all sorts of potential solutions to try and fix the lice problem. Harsh chemicals, cleaner fish like lump suckers and wrasse, salmon car washes, and even anti-louse lasers controlled by facial recognition software have all been tried. But it turns out that the solution to this parasite might be another parasite. One of my favourite types of parasites are the hyperparasites, the parasites which infect other parasites. It turns out that the salmon lice can host a very nasty type of fungal parasite known as a microsporidium. The microsporidians appear to interfere with the lice reproduction, and so it's been suggested that we could deliberately introduce the microsporidians in an attempt to control the sea lice. The idea of using parasites as pest control is actually quite old. In the 1880s, the United States imported parasitic wasps from Europe in an effort to manage invasive butterflies. Do you remember the crab castrating barnacles from earlier? Well, some scientists have suggested that we use them in the fight against the invasive green crab. If done well, biological pest control can be really successful, but it does also come with some potential risks. The next parasite on my list is one of my favourites because it's kind of the twist villain that none of us were expecting. When we think of parasites, we typically think of either something wormy or something mighty, and that's for a good reason. Those are two of the most common parasite body plans. But what if I told you that some of the scariest parasites are mollusks? It makes sense because the phylum Mollusca is one of the biggest, probably contains over 100,000 species, so it makes sense that at least a few of them would be parasites. There are snails which like to bury themselves inside starfish. There are mussels which like to live inside the esophagus of sea cucumbers. God, what is it with these sea cucumbers? But most ambitious are the snails which drink the blood of fish. Okay, you might be wondering how a snail manages to prey on fast-moving fish, but the answer is that they are very patient and very sneaky. At night on the coral reef, many fish, like parrotfish, go to sleep. They'll wedge themselves in crevices in the coral to hide, and this is where the snails take advantage of them. The snails will send out a snake-like proboscis up to 3 times the length of the snail. This proboscis probes the fish, looking for weak spots like the eye, mouth, or indeed anus, where it can insert itself and begin extracting fluid. The snails are even capable of squeezing through the little sleeping bag which some parrotfish produce to protect themselves from parasites. Now, amazingly, up to 28 snails have been seen feasting on the same fish, which is pretty damn horrific. A very similar type of snail has also been observed feeding on sleeping rays off the coast of California. How fitting that our next parasite also comes from the coast of California. Meet the mind-controlling worms. Many of the parasites that we've already discussed are directly transmitted, which means their life cycle is pretty simple and they'll only infect one animal throughout their lives. However, another type of transmission is trophic transmission, or via the food chain. In trophically transmitted parasites, the life cycle can be pretty complex and involves several hosts. The trematode worm Euhoplorchis californiensis likes to live inside birds. But once the bird poops out the worm's eggs, how does it reinfect the bird? Well, the tasty bird poop is consumed by snails, which the baby worms sterilise and then move on. It's very rude if you ask me. The baby worms then swim about off the coast until they find a California killifish. The worms latch onto the fish's gills, make their way inside and up to the fish's brain. They form tiny cysts on the fish's brain, and each fish can be infected with hundreds of individual worms. Now, what's the effect of all of these worms on the fish's brain? Well, they cause their hosts to commit suicide. The worms manipulate the fish's behaviour, causing them to swim very erratically and close to the surface, which catches the eye of nearby birds, therefore making it very likely that the fish will get eaten by the birds, thus completing the worm's life cycle. This mind-controlling behaviour is quite a common strategy among lots of trematodes. We see it in trematodes infecting snails, amphipods, and even mice. Finishing up our list, we have the curious case of the turtle leech. They might not look like much, but leeches are actually pretty extreme. They can survive temperatures of almost minus 200 degrees, and they've been found at over 8,000 metres deep in the Kuril-Kamchatka Trench. A really nasty type of leech is the genus Osobranchus, which specialises in drinking turtle blood. Leeches themselves are already quite bad, but what's worse is that when these leeches are drinking blood, sometimes they can leave something behind. You see, these leeches have been implemented as a possible vector for the transmission of a really, really horrible disease. When the leeches move on to a new turtle, they can pass along herpes virus, which, just like in humans, can be dormant and not cause any symptoms, but other times it can cause a really horrific condition called fibropapillomatosis, which causes massive tumours to erupt all over the turtle's body. The tumours themselves are quite benign, but they get so big that they can affect the turtle's vision and their ability to swim, which makes them vulnerable to predators and makes them more likely to get hit by boats. The really sad thing is that in some parts of Australia, over 50% of turtles are affected, and in some parts of Hawaii, up to 90% of turtles are infected with fibro or FP. Now, although the leeches might be spreading the herpes virus, we don't yet understand what triggers the outbreak, the expression of FP. But as always, it's probably linked to humans. You see, the outbreaks of FP seem to be linked to areas of high pollution, but we don't really know the mechanism by which high sewage levels might trigger the dormant herpes virus. This sort of thing happens quite a lot, where pretty harmless hitchhikers in an animal can suddenly turn and become horrible, savage parasites. It actually happens so much that it's been given a name. It's sometimes known as the guest to pest effect, or the Rasputin effect. This can also happen in corals too. Corals have endosymbiotic algae, the zooxanthellae, which they cohabitate with, but if it gets a bit too hot, then the algae stop providing the coral with food, and instead they start to become a burden on their coral hosts. Okay, so having got to this point, you're probably quite rightly thinking, my god, parasites are absolutely horrific and we should be doing everything we can to get rid of all of them. And I don't blame you. If you have a tapeworm or if your dog has a tapeworm, I'm definitely not saying that you need to keep it. However, I do think that parasites are demonised and made into villains when really I don't know if they even are. As humans, we tend to think of parasites merely as a disease and not as organisms in their own right. And I bet you've never even thought of the possibility of an endangered parasite, have you? Currently, only a few parasites have been evaluated by the IUCN Red List. My personal favourite is the pygmy hog sucking louse, which is a type of louse only found on the world's smallest pig, the pygmy hog. You might be thinking, what's the point? Why should we be conserving horrible, evil bloodsuckers? But I think parasites are just as worthy of protection as other animals. We shouldn't base conservation on human morals. And besides, if we did, we need to stop funding conservation immediately because, oh my god, the things that those dolphins have done. Parasitism is as much a part of nature as predation and competition. Just think of how many animals depend on parasites as a source of food. Now, there are definitely instances where I don't like parasites, for example, when they threaten human health, when they impact the conservation of an endangered species, or if the parasite was introduced somewhere new by humans. Nature is a very delicate and fragile network, and parasites are a part of that network. We don't even know to what extent yet, and there are still countless parasite species yet to be discovered. Again, to play devil's advocate, parasites can also be incredibly useful. Scientists have been able to use parasites to discover new species of sharks, to track the movements of little penguins, to monitor levels of pollution, and even to help crack down on the illegal wildlife trade. Maggots and leeches are occasionally used in modern medicine, and there's even some controversial research suggesting that parasites can help alleviate asthma and autoimmune disorders. Again, another disclaimer, if you are infected with a tapeworm, please do not keep it. In summary, by watching this video, I hope you can appreciate the amazing lengths that some parasites will go to in order to survive, and maybe reflect on how your own views impact how you view the natural world. I also hope that after watching this video, you too will develop the urge to pause and zoom in on nature documentaries to see what parasites are hanging off of animals. So yeah, that's why I think parasites are cool, because they teach us to appreciate the tiny worlds on and in us all.